ADA. I have a real honor to introduce Jared Diamond, who is a MacArthur Fellow and a Pulitzer Prize winner, and so many awards that are even hard to enumerate. When I first called Jared Diamond to invite him to do this talk, he just could not see what in the world the Department of Design would be interested in. So he even said, why do you want me to talk? I don't see the connection. And I thought, there's absolutely every connection in the world. When you think of trying to problem solve and all the design problems that we have with technology that involve social computing and humanizing technology, it's really important to have a sense of history. And this book, I actually did not want to read. When it was handed to me, and I thought, oh, it's huge, I have so much to do, I'm not going to read this, so I left it by my bedside, and I thought, let me take a little peek because everybody's being so excited about it. And I couldn't put it down. It's an amazing experience. Jared Diamond has a lot of fans, and I'm sure a lot of them are sitting right here. A lot more are online on the internet watching. And with that, with a very, very short intro, I'd like to introduce Jared Diamond.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you today. Let me first ask whether you can hear me in the back. As you mentioned, when you asked me to talk, I was thinking, what on earth can I talk about that would interest an audience up here? And it eventually occurred to me I could at least get design in by talking about the design of human bodies. Human bodies were, of course, not designed by an engineer consciously. Their design resulted through evolution unconsciously, but nevertheless there are interesting and still unsolved questions how we ended up with the design that we have. And to illustrate that, let me show you, just run quickly through some pictures of people with different body designs. Could I ask for the first slide? Do I press something here? This button. All right.
There it is.
Good. I'm just going to run through some pictures to emphasize that in some parts of the world, many or most people are designed with red hair and often with blue eyes. And in other parts of the world, many or most people have come to be designed with blonde hair and blue eyes. And in still other parts of the world, such as my beloved New Guinea, and I will now show you a few slides of my New Guinea friends from the New Guinea Highlands, everybody is designed with dark hair and dark eyes. And as you can see in this slide, all New Guinea Highlanders have dark hair and dark eyes. There are no blondes, there are no redheads. So why is it that people variously in different parts of the world end up with either red hair or yellow hair or brown hair or black hair as adults, and then gray hair or white hair when we're old? Each human population has a predominant hair color, but that color varies geographically. And of course, this is one of the most familiar and obvious facts about people, namely that we exhibit geographic variation. Specifically, what is the origin of our variability in our most visibly variable traits, namely our variation in skin color and hair color and eye color and form of hair. Surprisingly, it's these familiar traits that prove to be the ones whose variability is hardest to understand. This is, of course, an old problem that almost every major thinker from Herodotus to Darwin and onwards has wrestled with. It still isn't solved, but I think that one can make some progress by pulling together recent studies in other fields, particularly in physiology and in the biology of mate selection. My own interest in this subject stems from my interest in geographic variation in birds, on the one hand, and in human evolution on the other hand. I should, of course, emphasize at the outset that while talking about geographic variation, I'm not going to be mentioning races and I'm not going to be talking about races. That's because although humans vary geographically, that geographic variation does not fall into discrete types that could be pigeonholed as races. Human populations integrate with each other, so any scheme for dividing human populations into so-called races is arbitrary. And on top of that, geographic variation in different traits is not concordant. So if you chose to classify people racially based on their hemoglobins or on their ABO blood groups, you would end up with a completely different classification from the classification based on skin color. Well, the question of geographic variation, of course, is not unique to humans. It arises for any plant or animal species with a sufficiently large geographic range. Most animal and plant species with wide enough ranges have geographic variability, often in the same traits that vary in humans, such as eye color and external color. And just to illustrate this point, I've depicted here some birds, of which you can find a couple literally outside in the courtyard. Here, the towhees. There are white-eyed towhees, and there are red-eyed towhees, and there are brown-eyed towhees. So towhees, as well as humans, vary in eye color. There's also variation. We humans vary in our hair color. Birds, of course, vary in the feather color. And there are black-feathered peregrine falcons, and there are also brown-feathered peregrine falcons. And then here's a bird called the wagtail, yellow wagtail of Europe, where the detailed pattern of plumage varies in a complex way over Europe. All of the higher primates, our closest relatives, the great apes, namely the gibbons, the orangutans, the gorillas, and chimpanzees, vary in their hair color and skin color and length of hair and body size and proportions, just as we do. So this question about our design variability is a question not only for humans but also for most animals. There are three classes of explanations for geographic variation in animals, including humans, and those three explanations are natural selection, sexual selection, and neutral variation. The idea behind natural selection is that different selective forces in different parts of the world select for different traits in different areas because of different consequences for the ability of the plant or animal to survive. For example, in biology, there's something called the Bergman effect. Within the same species, you tend to get larger animals at high latitudes or at high altitudes in the Arctic or on tops of mountains. That's just because of considerations of heat conservation. A larger animal conserves heat more readily than a small animal. So Arctic animals of a given species are, on the average, larger than tropical animals of the same species. And there's also widespread, that's a result of natural selection. Natural selection has also produced differences in pigmentation. One usually finds that animals in wet climates, like tropical rainforests, are darker than animals of the same species in light climates, like deserts, partly to match the substrate and partly for other reasons. Natural selection certainly accounted for geographic variation of some human characteristics. For example, the so-called abnormal hemoglobins, like sickle cell hemoglobin, which is widespread in parts of Africa, Arabia, and India. Sickle cell hemoglobin protects you against malaria, and so sickle cell hemoglobin is common in parts of the old world where malaria was a serious problem, but the sickle cell gene is absent in other parts of the world. And one finds also differences in human body shape. People in the Arctic at high latitude tend to have short arms and legs and a compact body shape, whereas people in hot, dry climates like the Sudanese tend to be long and slender. And that's, again, because people in the Arctic need to conserve heat. Those in the Sudan need to radiate heat. So that's an example of natural selection accounting for some differences, some geographic variation in humans. A second explanation besides geographic variation is sexual selection. Sexual selection refers to arbitrary body signals possessed by one sex, provoking a reaction by members of the same sex or the opposite sex and affecting mating success. And just to show you one example from birds, these are birds of paradise from New Guinea. Up on top are the males, down below are the females that are duller. All these males are closely related birds of paradise, but depending upon the region, some males have red plumes and some have yellow plumes and some have white plumes and some have blue plumes. And in each area, the females have co-evolved with the males to prefer males with red or white or yellow or blue plumes, depending upon the area. The color of the plumes is completely arbitrary, but a given signal and a reaction of the same sex and the opposite sex to that signal has evolved differently in different areas. Now, sexual selection surely explains geographic variability of some human traits, particularly the human traits that we care a lot about in our sexual preferences, such as the size and shape of breasts and nipple color in women. Men care a lot about women's breasts, and the fact that women of southern Africa, the so-called sand people, differ from other women in having orange nipples is not because orange nipples helps you escape from lions in southern Africa, but it's because sand men have evolved to prefer orange nipples and Aboriginal Australian men have not. And again, among men, men vary, men from different parts of the world vary in the length and in the angle of the penis. And the fact that sand men have penises which, when non-erect, stand nevertheless at an average of a higher angle than men elsewhere in the world is again not because a penis at a high angle lets you escape from lions, but that's what sand women of southern Africa have evolved to expect. And again, men around the world vary in the extent of body hair and in the extent of facial hair. And all you women here know that you care a lot about the body hair and the facial hair of men. If you're one of those who have the good judgment and wisdom to prefer men with beards, then you will not settle for anything less. But if you're a woman from Southeast Asia, then you would have grown up to consider a beard as hideous beyond words. So differences in these sexually selected traits have no survival value. Nevertheless, they have a big effect on our sexual preferences. They are arbitrary sexual signals that vary from population to population. That gives us two alternative explanations for traits that vary geographically: natural selection and sexual selection. And the third and last selective force is what's called neutral variation, namely traits that have no effect on survival or on mating success, and that vary geographically just because of a history of founder effects and genetic drifts. For example, in humans, our fingerprints have different patterns. Some of us have lots of loops in our fingerprints, and some don't have closed loops, but instead whorls. That's to say, loops that don't close at the base. Aboriginal Australians tend to have lots more whorls than loops, and Europeans and Africans tend to have lots more loops than whorls. But this has no effect on mating success. I challenge any of you to tell me whether your beloved has loops or whorls in his/her fingerprints. And it also has no effect on survival. You can get as good a precision grip with loops as in whorls. So that then is a third factor underlying geographic variation. In humans, the traits whose geographic variation is most conspicuous and the traits that lay people think of first when you mention human so-called races are, of course, the visible traits: color of skin, color of eyes, color of hair, and form of hair. People assume that geographic variation in skin color is well understood, supposedly, as the outcome of natural selection, and people therefore infer that the same is true for geographic variation in eye color and in hair color. And so I'm going to have to spend a few minutes showing you that the usual interpretation of skin color is wrong. Otherwise, you're going to stop listening to the rest of my talk in the belief that the problem of geographic variation in human skin color has already been solved. Here is the usual claim about human skin color, and it's illustrated on the chart. You all know, supposedly, humans tend to have darker skin towards the equator and paler skin towards the poles. And the evidence cited in favor of this wide-sweeping claim is a few facts, namely that in 3 parts of the world towards the equator, there are people with dark skins, namely in Africa, in southern India, and in Melanesia in Australia. That's true, and it's also true that in one area at high latitudes, namely Scandinavia, occur the people with the lightest skins in the world. So that then is generalized to the claim that people tend to have dark skins near the equator, and the interpretation placed on it is that supposedly it's to protect you against sunburn and skin cancer. It's certainly true that Europeans develop transiently darker skins in the summer, supposedly to protect you against the sun rays and skin cancer. And so the argument is that the geographic differences in skin color, which are genetic, not turned on and off as tanning, those geographic differences are analogous and protect light-skinned people against the risk of skin cancer, which is something that Australians of European origin worry a great deal about in tropical Australia. So it certainly is a real factor, but it's a weak factor. Skin cancer causes few deaths, causes little debilitation. It comes on late in life rather than in infancy or in your prime reproductive years. And in its selective value, skin cancer and sunburn are completely trivial compared to the major diseases of childhood, which are a much bigger selective factor in humans. A more serious objection to the theory that geographic variation in human skin color somehow is related to natural selection through skin cancer is that the generalization is just wrong. First, on the previous slide, let me point out to you that there are plenty of people living on the equator with very light skin, and there are people living at high latitudes. The Tasmanians living at the latitude of Vladivostok and Chicago have very dark skins. So it's not the case that people towards the equator consistently have darker skins. And even worse, it's also not the case that the people who have dark skins are in the areas that have the most sunshine. Here are maps of the actual total annual hours of sunshine around the world when you take into account things such as cloud color and varying day length. And as you see, the people with the darker skins in equatorial Africa and southern India and Melanesia are in areas where, given cloud cover, there's really not that much sunlight. And the people in the areas with the greatest sunshine, namely on the Pacific coast of Chile and Peru and in the western United States and in Arabia and northeastern Africa, those are not the people with the darker skins. So the supposed correlation between skin color and equatorial position breaks down. And the result is that biologists have come up with all sorts of explanations other than skin cancer to account for dark skins. It's suggested that pale skins let you produce vitamin D, or that dark skins shield you from producing too much vitamin D, or that dark skins camouflage you in the jungle, or that dark skins protect you against light breaking down your vitamins. But the basic answer is that dark skins are not accumulated near the equator, and we don't know the explanation for. There is not a factor of natural selection which explains why you will survive better with a darker skin in some places than in other places. As for the other human traits that vary geographically, consider our eye color. Our eyes can be blue or green or gray or brown, and our hair can be red if you're in Ireland, or yellow if you're in Scandinavia, or brown or black, or if you're older, gray or white. And our hair form can be straight, or can be curled, or can be tightly coiled. All of these geographically varying features show no consistent correlation with climate, and there are no serious explanations in terms of natural selection for their variation. Nobody has come up with an argument why it's good to have red hair in Ireland. Does red hair let you escape leprechauns? Is it something to do with the Irish climate? Well, other parts of the world have climates similar to Ireland, but no red hair. No serious theories for the selective value of eye color, or hair form. Now, Darwin himself, the discoverer of natural selection, was well aware of all these obstacles to explaining geographic variation in human skin and eyes and hair by natural selection. And so after he had finished his book on the origin of species, he then wrote a second book, even longer, entitled Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex, in which he concluded that natural selection plays no role in human variation in skin and eye and hair color. Instead, Darwin attributed geographic variation in those external traits to sexual selection, the force which we have no doubt accounts for geographic variation in human breast size and shape and nipple color and beards and penis length and angle. Darwin noticed that when we choose our sex partners, we pay inordinate attention not only to the breasts and beards of our sex partners, but also to their skin and hair and eyes. These features, skin and hair and eye color, form our beauty standards, which are arbitrary and vary a lot geographically, depending upon where you were raised and who you see around you when you're growing up. So, for example, many Americans, and certainly Northern Europeans, are taught to believe that gentlemen prefer blondes, but my New Guinea friends consider blondes just too hideous for words, because New Guineans have grown up with nothing except dark-haired people around them, and the only semi-blondes they see are albinos and people with nutritional problems. So of course they consider blondes absolutely hideous. By Darwin's argument, it would be a historical accident that the Irish ended up red-haired and blue-eyed, and Native Americans ended up dark-haired and dark-eyed. It was just an accident of who happened to be among the first people crossing Bering Strait or crossing the Irish Sea. It could easily have happened the other way, but once it started that way, once you got red-haired people in Ireland, then the Irish evolved to prefer red-haired people, and New Guineans evolved or grew up to despise the appearance of red-haired people. Now, that was Darwin's argument, sexual selection. Darwin, though, could not be sure of two things. The idea behind sexual selection of skin color is that people on the average prefer to mate with people with skin and eye and hairs and physical appearance that's similar to the people that they see around them as they're growing up. Is that really true? We all think anecdotally that we actually prefer exotic people. Supposedly American men really, if given the chance, would prefer Polynesian women or exotic women. And yes, we do have some fondness for the exotic, but on the average, given a choice, would most American men marry a Polynesian or the girl next door? Darwin did not have the numbers on that. And the other question is, if these traits really are local and arbitrary beauty standards favoring the locally familiar, are these beauty standards transmitted genetically, or are they learned? Well, information has accumulated about that in recent years from the studies of many psychologists who are interested, who carry out questionnaires and surveys of who marries whom. So there are lots of papers by psychologists looking at couples who are dating on the first date and couples going steady and fiancés and married couples and happily married couples and divorced couples, correlating who picks who and who stays with who with a whole battery of personality and intelligence and physical characteristics. And what the psychologists calculate is so-called correlation coefficients. A high correlation coefficient of plus 1.0 means that you tend to marry someone who looks almost identical to you. A correlation coefficient of minus 1.0 means that you seek out someone as a sex partner who's as different as possible from you. And a correlation coefficient of 0 means that for that particular trait, you don't care about that trait in your sex partners and spouses. So psychologists have measured correlation coefficients within mated couples for a whole batch of traits. Not surprisingly, the highest correlation coefficients of plus 0.9 are for religion and socioeconomic status and ethnic affiliation. We really do tend to end up marrying people of the same religion and the same socioeconomic status and ethnic affiliation. The correlation coefficient for personality traits such as extroversion, intelligence, and so on is considerably lower, plus 0.4, meaning that extroverts on the average do tend to marry extroverts, but it's a weaker correlation. Now, the interesting thing in this context is that there are also positive correlations for physical traits. That's to say, people tend to marry people resembling themselves physically in any one of a wide variety of physical characteristics. and psychologists have tested dozens of characteristics. What I think is going to astonish you will be which are the physical characteristics that people care most about in picking their mate. Let me ask you, would anyone here like to guess what is the physical characteristic in which a happily married man and woman resemble each other most closely? Would anyone like to guess? Weight? Good guess, but height? Good guess, but again, no. It's true that people do tend to marry people of similar height and weight, but there's something that's an even better predictor. I don't think you're going to guess this one. It is, believe it or not, length of middle finger, and I'm not joking. Put up here are the correlation coefficients for a whole series of physical traits between mated man and woman. Studies have been carried out in so-called whites in the United States and among Africans and other populations. The best predictor is length of middle finger. People with long middle fingers tend to marry other people with long middle fingers. Other traits with strong predictive value are the circumference of the wrist. Thin-wristed people tend to marry thin-wristed people. Length of earlobe, people with long earlobes tend to marry other people with long earlobes. Distance between the eyes, interocular distance, is also a characteristic. Why on earth is this the case? Well, I think it's clear that these are not things that we can enunciate consciously. I don't think that any of you could tell me offhand much about how the length of middle finger of your spouse or significant other compares with the median in the population. Nevertheless, we are all aware of the fact that when you walk into a room, you don't spend 20 minutes taking detailed descriptions of everybody in the room and then adding things up and say, that person really turns me on sexually. Instead, you walk into the room and within 10 seconds, you know who you like the looks of in that room and who doesn't turn you on in that room. These are quick judgments based upon a quick sense of external physical appearance, taking in everything, including slenderness of fingers and earlobes and distance between the eyes. You add it up. Now, I have to warn you, I'm concerned that you may go home this evening and start doing some inappropriate things. I want to remind you, these are average moderate trends, and so I don't want you to go home, measure the middle finger length of your significant other, and say, now I finally understand why we should never have gotten married, mine is long and yours is short, or to measure your SO's earlobe and say, you wretch, you have a short earlobe length, how could I ever not have noticed that? I'm filing with my lawyer today. Remember, these are averages based on that trait over many couples, and we're selecting our partners based on dozens of physical characteristics, including all these non-physical characteristics. You cannot get what you want in every characteristic, and so you may love your spouse dearly, even though your spouse is mismatched in middle finger length. I love my wife dearly, even though I prefer women with wide-set eyes, and my wife, as I discovered when I first passed her the opera glasses at a first ballet, my wife has narrow-set eyes. That's not what I would have chosen first, but I've made peace with my wife's narrow-set eyes because she has right-matched earlobes and she has many other virtues. So, an average positive association between mates and their physical characteristics will tend to conserve the physical appearance of a human population because probably we develop our tastes in our sex partners depending upon who we see around us as we grow up. And that means then that you will tend to prefer someone who resembles the people around you. So if you grew up in Ireland surrounded by redheads, you will want to marry a redhead and the Irish will remain red-haired. Can one demonstrate that beauty standards, are they genetic or are they learned? The answer probably varies among animal species. In animals, you can do experiments that would be impossible in humans. There's a goose called the snow goose, which varies in external color, just as we humans, but it's not nice to take humans and to spray them either brown, yellow, white, or black and send them out to a dance and see what partners they attract home. But you can do that with geese. There's a goose in the article called the snow goose, which occurs in two color phases. There's the white snow goose and the blue snow goose. And then you can raise them in captivity and spray them pink and get pink snow geese. So you can bring up a snow goose surrounded by either white or blue or pink snow geese, and then see what that snow goose goes for when it's grown up. And it turns out that a snow goose prefers to mate with a goose of the color of the geese that it saw surrounding it when it was a young goose, a gosling. And my final slide is going to be a graphic demonstration of the role of learning in sexual preference in rats. Baby boy rats, as they grow up and they're nursing their mother, and rats depend a lot on smell. So some rat psychologists did the following experiment. Does a boy rat learn or inherit knowledge of what makes a beautiful female rat? And the experiment was as follows. Divide mother rats suckling their babies into two groups, and some of those mother rats, you spray their nipples and their vaginas with citral, a perfume that smells of lemon. And then the other mother rats, you spray just with saline, having no smell. And then you take their young male rats that were nursing them, and when the males grow up, you put the male into a chamber with a female rat, and you measure the length of time until that male mounts the female, because usually you put a male rat in a chamber with a female rat and will eventually mount the female. You measure the length of the time until the male ejaculates in that female. And there are four groups: male rats whose mothers smelled of lemon. Those male rats ejaculate in 680 seconds when confronted with a female rat that smells of lemon, but it takes them much longer, 10-50 seconds, to get turned on to ejaculation by a female that does not smell of lemon. Whereas the reciprocal experiment, a male rat whose mother smelled normally, not of lemon, when you present that male rat as an adult with a female smelling of lemon, that's a turn off, and the male takes over 1,000 seconds to ejaculate, but you give that male a female that does not smell of lemon, and he is ejaculated in 750 seconds, demonstrating that experience in infancy during male rats, in this case experience in smell, is what forms the beauty standards of the male rat when it grows up. The male learns what constitutes a beautiful rat from its mother. And for us humans generally, studies have shown that we form our beauty standards from the people around us as we grow up, that men particularly form their beauty standards as boys from their mothers and from their sisters if they have any, and from playmates around them, and that girls also form their beauty standards, especially from their fathers and from their brothers if they have any, and from playmates. So there's an old adage about summing up human mate selection. It's summed up in a song, "I want a girl just like the girl that married dear old dad." And there is truth of that. On the average, men do end up seeking out to marry women who resemble their mother and sister, namely, and that means resemble themselves genetically, who resemble their mother and sister in earlobe length and interocular distance and skin color and hair color and eye color and circumference of wrist and length of middle finger, all those physical traits. That's what forms sexual preference. So just to summarize then, here in the School of Design, you're mostly concerned with design that you created yourselves. But nature has also created design, not consciously, but instead unconsciously, either through natural selection or sexual selection or through neutral variation. Among humans, our design and the externally visible characteristics, especially the ones we most care about, not just the genitalia and breasts, but also skin and eye and hair color and hair form, those traits vary a great deal geographically, as caught metaphorically in the title of my talk about why the Irish have red hair. That geographic variation poses biological questions that are much more interesting and complicated, and that, in fact, are less well understood than we usually assume. Thank you.
We have time for questions. Is anybody interested in asking Dr. Diamond a question? Yes, there's a question. Sorry. Here, can you use the mic because we're straight?
Yes. How do you account for the interest in interracial dating and marriage? What would you attribute that to if you say it's people look like each other?
Could you say that again?
What would you attribute the interest in interracial dating and marriage?
The interest in interracial
They
dating.
transcend the way they look, the way they grow up.
Yeah, I would say two things. One is that on the average in the United States, it still is the case that there's more intra so-called racial marriage than there is interracial in so-called racial marriage. But it's also the case that there is a lot more marriage of people who look less like you nowadays than there was 30, 40 years ago. And I would guess that's because nowadays people are spending lots more time with people who look different from them physically. And the proof of that is you just walk out on UCLA campus. What one sees is not. I'll give you an anecdote. I graduated college in 1958. And I was at Harvard College, and my class had 1,100 people. And in that class of 1,100 people, something like 1,060 were so-called whites, and there were about a dozen African Americans in my Harvard class, and there were about a dozen and maybe 20 Asian Americans. And that has all changed massively in the last several decades. So of course, people are seeing a lot more of people from other ethnic groups, and people are ending up marrying, and dating more and marrying more.
So we could actually surmise that with the evolution of the global culture, with technology and travel, we could actually end up with a lot of hybrid.
We are. Yeah, with international culture and travel, we are ending up with a lot more so-called hybrids, meaning that lots of people nowadays are ending up marrying someone of rather different geographic origins, whereas in the old days, 10,000 years ago, there was zero chance for that.
Is there any other questions? Right here.
Yes.
Oh, there's also the element of sound and the use of the voice in sexual selection amongst animals of so many different species. Do you know if any study has ever been done, comparable studies with humans for acoustic design? The use of the voice, the characteristics of the human voice as a mating tool.
That's a very interesting question. I don't happen to know the answer, but it certainly is the case that humans vary not only in visual characteristics, but also in voice and in smell. There have been a fair number of studies. They're often summarized as the T-shirt armpit studies, but there are a lot of serious studies about human preference for the smells of different people, and I would guess that there are also preference in voice. I remember my wife telling me as she reflected back on our first date that one of the things that she liked on first date was my voice, and there are other women who would be turned off by my voice. So yes, I'm sure that auditory cues and olfactory cues, as well as visual cues, are important for humans, and as you mentioned, they're far more important for other animals. A rat cares much more about olfactory cues, and the mockingbirds outside here care a lot about auditory cues.
What about cultural pressure? For instance, people may be attracted to each other, but because of racism, that doesn't really happen.
Absolutely. That's certainly true. Cultural factors play an enormous role, and I mentioned that the highest correlation coefficients in who marries whom are for religion, socioeconomic status, political views also, and that reflects that who attracts you physically, you don't necessarily end up marrying that person. And so I would guess that if one could do these physical correlation coefficients, not on who marries whom, but on who goes to bed with whom without marrying them, there you would get a purer measure of physical attraction, uncontaminated by socioeconomic status. Do you care about the religion of the person that you jump into bed with? Sorry, we got the wrong pronoun. Does one care? My apologies. If you could poll people, does one care about the religion of the person that you jump into bed with for one night? I would guess that religion is not going to have a 0.9 correlation coefficient for a one-night date.
Did you want
Looking at your statistics on fingers, lengths, and earlobe lengths, and so on, I just wonder whether it's about time to recognize that statistics are just misused all the time, and nobody really understands that just because there's a correlation apparent between the middle finger and length of middle finger and choices, that there is any fundamental connection between the two.
That's a pervasive question in statistics. Particularly a table of correlation coefficients gives you correlation coefficients. It doesn't give you causes. And once you've got the correlation coefficients, you then have to figure out the causes involved. For example, with middle finger, one of the first things that you worry about is, does middle finger just correlate with something else that we notice more? Does middle finger simply correlate well with height? Well, you can remove the effect of height, and you can show that people really do care about length of middle finger separately from height. But again, is it that middle finger is a surrogate for shape of hand or for touch of hand? That's all a matter that has to be studied by research, just as any other statistical correlation.
But just questioning the idea that there is a correlation, because in the matter of chance, it could just happen. If you throw dice umpteen number of times, and many people throw dice, that there might be someone who would throw more of one type of dice.
That's right.
One combination. There may be no correlation between that person's hand or the throwing style. In other words, with the middle finger, if it wasn't middle finger, it might have been the third finger. Mm-hmm. It could easily have turned out to be that way, because it is possible that everything would not end up on a zero even level.
That's correct. That too is a universal question in statistical correlations. When you discover a correlation, is it significant, or would it arise just by chance? Sometimes this is referred to as the Uranus effect. If you look at the conjunctions of all the planets, and you look at events in human history, if you look at times when the planet Uranus was in conjunction with the sun, and you go through enough historical events, eventually you will find some event that correlated with the conjunctions of the planet Uranus. Does it mean that the planet Uranus produces war? No, it does not. And there are statistical tests that warn you whether the correlation that you've got is a correlation of this sort that you would just get from the statistics of large numbers. So these are standard statistical issues.
Could you talk a little bit about your research process? You could use this as an example, or your Guns, Germs, and Steel book. One of the things that fascinated me was the huge breadth that you took, which I think explains why so many people from so many different disciplines are actually influenced by it. But what is your research methodology, speaking of statistics?
Well, my own research methodology, as one of my colleagues is now in the room, and he will confirm to you, as have all my students for the past couple of decades, that I am a statistical ignoramus and am not capable of using statistics. My own methodology is to look for interesting questions and let them gestate, and eventually there comes a moment when it's right to study that question. For example, I've been interested for a long time in the history of India. I've not been to India, but there are some very interesting questions about the Indian subcontinent. There were not circumstances that galvanized me, but within the past few months, I've started corresponding with an ecologist from India about the history of the Indian subcontinent. And the history of the Indian subcontinent ties into a lot of other things. It ties into physical appearance, ties into genetics, ties into linguistics, the most complicated linguistic area in the world. Really interesting socioeconomic history, really interesting social stratification. So in order to understand India, you have to understand everything else in the world. And that's true for most things. In order to understand human-made choice, you also have to understand a lot of other things in the world.
But you're still leaving me with the question, what is the methodology? Do you research all the different, in other words, you cover so much. Do you go subject by subject, or you go through areas and weave through and come back?
Yeah, my own methodology is to pick out large subjects. Usually I'm working on several simultaneously. For example, at the moment, I'm finishing a book on the origin of bird species in the islands east of New Guinea. I'm in the early stages of writing a book on the collapses of ancient civilizations. I'm also finishing with a colleague a paper on the growth of snake intestine following surgical modification. And I'm on the early stages of this project on the history of India. So I pick a few areas, switch back and forth between the areas, but they tend to be long-term projects. The book on origin of bird species we've been working on for 30 years. And the book on collapses of ancient civilizations is going to be a 5-year project.
And one last question from me. When I asked the design faculty to recommend speakers, your name came from Professor Vasa, who told us that he was profoundly influenced by the book. The following week, I was actually given a book by another professor's wife who bought a stack of your books and started handing it out to her friends because she felt, you have to read this. And in fact, I was resistant, as I said earlier, but I really was fascinated. So my last question to you would be, what do you think you, in that book, really hit the nerve in such a larger public, and it really actually moved into popular culture, other than your writing style?
Why is it that Guns, Germs, and Steel really did hit the nerve for lots of people? I think it's because Guns, Germs, and Steel deals with the most obvious question of history, namely why history unfolded differently for people of different continents. Why is it that here within this room we are on land that 500 years ago everybody at the site would have been Native American, and yet here in this room most people are of Old World origin? Why did it turn out that way rather than the reverse way? It's the most obvious question about history, but historians, not only have they not answered the question, historians don't address the question, and the result is that the usual explanation that people fall back on with, I hate to say it, but they'll come out with racist explanation. But I think people are really people suspect the racist explanations, but they gravitate towards them because they are not told what the correct explanation is. So I think one reason why the book hit a nerve for people is that it deals with this most obvious question. And the other reason is human history and everything about it is just so fascinating.
Getting specific again and looking at the data that points toward people who choose mates and or spouses that resemble physically people in their family, sisters, mothers, for example. Do you feel that if we didn't place such moral or legal limitations on ourselves that people would be marrying, say, men would be marrying their sisters and mothers?
No, it does not require, it's not solely because of laws that we don't marry our sisters. There's abundant evidence in humans, as in most animal species, for a so-called incest taboo. That's to say, all human societies that I know of, except for the top classes in a couple of state societies, the Incas and the Pharaohs. Virtually all human societies have by law or precept an incest taboo, but most people also obey an incest taboo. And there's another very interesting area of study showing the development of our instinctive incest taboo, namely that those people, the actual individuals that you see around you up until the age of 6, you do not marry those individuals. You instead marry individuals resembling them. And particularly instructive are studies in Israeli kibbutzes, where children are reared together in a group. And studies of kibbutzes show that although these are the people that you've seen the most of and that are most available to you as marriage partners, there are essentially never marriages between people who grew up in the same kibbutz unless one of those people moved in after the age of 6. So the message is that the individuals that you see before the age of 6, you learn that those individuals trigger your incest taboo, and you seek individuals who resemble them but who are not those individuals.
This is 2 quick questions. One, could you say something about why do civilization collapse, and who are your favorite historians?
And
Who are your favorite historians?
Okay, my favorite historian, Thucydides, and which are the civilizations that collapsed. There's a whole list of them. The Anasazi in the U.S. Southwest, the Maya, the lowland Maya in Central America, many Polynesian societies such as Easter Island, Great Zimbabwe in Africa, Fertile Crescent societies, Harappan Indus Valley Society in the Indian subcontinent, Angkor Wat. Those are the most flagrant examples. And of course, the big question is, question mark, us today in the next 60 years, which is why I'm writing the book.
In the next 60 years?
Yeah, we have about 60 years to get our environmental act together. Otherwise, it'll be too late.
And the second question?
Oh, my favorite historian, Thucydides.
Professor, you're saying that the collapse of those civilizations is related strictly to environmental influences? Is that your premise?
Is it the case that the collapses of civilizations are related strictly to environmental causes? No, civilizations can collapse for lots of reasons. They can collapse because of external climate change. They can collapse because they mismanage their own environment. They can collapse because of a disease. They can collapse because some neighbors walked in and conquered them. They can collapse because of several of these things going on together. And so the challenge of my next book will be to sort out these factors and differences in different collapses.
And when is that scheduled to be published?
I've signed a contract to deliver it on December 31st of 2003.
Okay,
I have
thank
some
you.
work to do.
Have you read Chancellor William, Destruction of Black Civilization?
I'm sorry?
Have you read Chancellor William, Destruction of Black Civilization?
No, I have not, but I'm sure it'll be on my list for the next 3 years.
Anyone else? Well, thank you so much. Thank you. And thank you for coming. And one quick announcement before you leave. Tonight we have a distinguished guest from the University of Brighton, Dr. Karamjit Gill, who's sitting right there, who will continue the human-centered issues, but dealing with computational science, and in particular about how multicultural environments are created using technology. So I invite you to come at 6 o'clock. Thank you. Right here at the ADA.